It was our senior year of high school, and spring break had just arrived. Most of our friends had gone away on vacation, leaving just me and one of my best friends at home. We decided to make the most of it by going on a late-night drive, hoping to have a relaxing time, listen to music, and simply just enjoy each other's company. We were listening to a classic 90s playlist that played everything from pop to punk rock. We drove aimlessly through the familiar streets of our small town, the darkness of the night casting an eerie ambience over everything. The quiet residential neighborhood seemed deserted, with only the occasional streetlight piercing through the darkness. As we turned a corner, engrossed in conversation, a sudden movement caught our attention. A figure moved from the shadows, running frantically in our direction. Startled, I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to an abrupt halt. My friend and I exchanged glances. Our hearts were pounding in our chests. I felt like if I didn't slam on the brakes, I would have absolutely run into this insane-looking man. He was so disturbing to look at. He was very disheveled and his clothes were torn and dirty. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, as if he was consumed by some other influence. Without warning, he lunged toward our car, landing forcefully on the hood. Shock gripped us, rendering us immobile. At this moment, I felt so much terror. It may not sound scary, but just picture yourself in the middle of the night and some random man throwing themselves on top of your car. Frantically, we scrambled for the door locks, our trembling hands struggling to find the right buttons. Finally, with a collective gasp of relief, we managed to secure the doors, but the man was relentless. We could clearly see his demented determination as he clawed and pounded on the car, trying to gain entry. He was like a rabid animal trying to break into the car. Panic overwhelmed us, and a primal instinct to escape surged within me. With shaking hands, I shifted the car into reverse, pressing the gas pedal with all of my might. The tires screeched as the vehicle hurtled backwards, leaving skid marks on the pavement. My friend and I watched in terror as the man, now standing in the middle of the street, screamed incoherently. His face looked like it was filled with so much rage. I literally reversed the entire length of the street. Once I finally turned the car around, we didn't look back. Our focus locked on the narrow road ahead. The night seemed to stretch on forever as we raced away. As we caught our breath, the reality of what had just happened had sank in. We had narrowly escaped a seemingly deranged individual, a chance encounter that had left us shaken to our very core. The memory of his haunting demeanor and the sound of his desperate screams would forever be etched into my mind. We did report the incident to the authorities, hoping they would find the man and prevent him from inflicting harm onto others. However, the experience left us scarred and our sense of safety shattered. Spring break would never be the same again, as the specter of that disturbing encounter loomed over us, a reminder that darkness could still exist, even in the most familiar corners of our lives. I love taking long drives. For me, it's therapeutic and relaxing. Sometimes I throw on music, sometimes I listen to podcasts, and honestly, sometimes I just sit in silence and reflect on my thoughts. Around 6 months ago, I had some stuff happen in my life and I was feeling extremely depressed. It was like life collapsed all around me, and I just felt like I wanted to get away. So I did the only thing I knew how to do when I was feeling down, and that was go for a long drive. I left my house around 10 at night and I just kept driving. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to drive. I figured that I had my phone, and whenever I wanted to head back to reality, I would just plug my information into the GPS. And before I knew it, I was driving seemingly in the middle of nowhere. No lights were illuminating the street, and I went quite a few miles without seeing any houses. A little after 2 in the morning, I was getting ready to make my way home, and I pulled out my phone. I, of course, didn't have any service. So I kind of figured that I would just turn around and keep driving until I found service. When I was getting ready to turn around, I noticed something strange up ahead. I decided to go check it out. As I closed in, I noticed it was a truck in the middle of the road. I slowly approached the truck in my vehicle, and when I was close, I noticed that there was a person lying on the ground next to the truck. My immediate thought was that this person was in trouble, so I sped up to the truck and tried to see if the person was okay. I parked a few feet away and ran over to the person on the ground. It was a woman in her 20s, if I had to guess. I shouted and asked if she was okay. She started to move around a little bit. She started to mumble something under her breath. I squatted down to the woman and asked again if she was alright. And when I was only inches away, her eyes bulged open and a massive smile emerged on her face. Then, in a disturbing voice, she said, "Gotcha!" Before I had any time to react, two larger figures came out from the bed of the truck. The woman rose to her feet, laughing as the two men jumped out of the back of the truck. Fight or flight mode kicked in. I ended up pushing the woman into the other two men, and in that brief moment of confusion, I ran back to my car and peeled off in the opposite direction. I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw the three of them scrambling. It looked like they had gotten into the truck. I was flying down the road at a dangerous speed. If they did pursue me, I think I was far enough out of sight that they never caught me. After this incident, I had a new outlook on life. Sure, life gets hard for me, but I'm just so thankful that I have my life. I have no idea what would have happened if I didn't act what I did. It gave me nightmares for a while, thinking about what could have happened. If you ever see anyone who looks like they're in trouble, just be careful, because some people in this world truly are evil. It was a dark and starless night when my girlfriend and I embarked on a spontaneous nighttime drive. The road stretched ahead, and it was incredibly long and winding. As we ventured deep down the mysterious road, it seemed to become even more narrow and more dark. As we continued down the path, my girlfriend started to intently stare out of the window. Then, out of nowhere, my girlfriend suddenly called out, her voice filled with panic. She claimed to have seen a young child waving at us from the side of the road. I was perplexed, and I ended up stopping the car and scanning the area for any signs of life. When all I saw was an empty expanse of darkness. Her insistence, however, compelled me to investigate further. We stepped out of the car and began to search the surroundings. Our steps were cautious and filled with worry. What was I going to do if there was actually a young child out here? Yet, despite our efforts, there was no trace of any child, or any living presence for that matter. Doubt started to creep into my mind, wondering if my girlfriend's eyes had been playing tricks on her. After all, it was dark, and the lights of my car could have reflected off of something, causing my girlfriend to think that there was in fact a small child out on the cliffs. Just as I struggled to believe her, I thought I could hear the sound of scurrying footsteps. I turned around, and I was speechless at what I was looking at. A young girl appeared behind us. Her face was innocent and sweet, yet her worn and tattered clothes told a different story. And it was as if she had emerged from the depths of the cliff. Her clothes were so dirty, it wouldn't have surprised me if she lived in the mountains somewhere. With a soft voice and pleading eyes, she asked if we could give her a ride to see her mommy. My girlfriend and I exchanged a wary glance, and we were instantly gripped with worry. I don't know what it was. Maybe something about the girl's presence and her desperate need for help, but something compelled us to agree. When we walked back to the car, the weight of the mysterious encounter was hanging heavily on us. We whispered back and forth to each other as we walked back, and we agreed that we would call the police as soon as we reached the safety of the car, since we both had left our phones in the vehicle. Once we reached the car, I turned around, only to find that the girl had vanished into thin air. Panic overtook us as we searched the area once more. I was freaking out because I knew not 2 seconds ago a little girl was standing right next to me. Yet, there was no trace of her. It was as if she had been swallowed by the darkness of night. Fear completely overtook me as we hurriedly dialed the emergency line, desperate for answers, and more importantly, reassurance that we weren't losing our minds. The police arrived, their search revealing no evidence of the mysterious little girl. We were left with unanswered questions, haunted by the uncertainty of what we had encountered that fateful night. Was she a lost soul, a wandering spirit seeking solace, or perhaps a shared delusion, a figment of our collective imagination? Or was it potentially the worst option of the bunch, and this was a legitimately lost girl looking for her mother? The truth eluded us, but the lingering presence of that encounter left an undeniable mark on our lives. The reality is, I have no idea what we encountered that evening, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, I will never forget the face of that little girl from that haunting night drive.
I've only shared this story one other time before with my brother. Several years ago, I was in my mid-20s, and honestly, I was a bit of a loser. I was in and out of different jobs, and I'd already dropped out of college 2 times. I still lived at home with my parents, and it wasn't something I was proud of, but I couldn't afford my own place yet. Next door to my parents' house was a man named Zeke, and this wasn't his real name, but he often said nobody knew his real name, so everybody just called him Zeke. Now, it's important to note in this story that Zeke was a miserable, middle-aged man. He was probably about 6 foot tall, with a decent build other than a slowly developing beer belly. He was slightly bald on top, and had long hair about shoulder length, and had a scruffy beard. And every time we saw Zeke, he looked angry or mad about something. We used to say that he didn't sleep, mainly because he used to have these huge bags under his eyes. Rarely left the house, and when he did, he usually came back within minutes. Zeke wasn't always like this, though. My parents have always lived next door to him, and when I was a little kid, he used to live there with his family. He had a wife and 2 daughters, and I think we were about the same age. I remember oftentimes we would be in the backyard, having cookouts and swimming in the pools that he used to have in his yard. Actually, we would go over for cookouts all the time when I was younger. It seemed like the perfect family. Suddenly, though, things just seemed to diminish. My family and I would hear fights next door that always ended with the police being called. We would hear the poor children crying as Zeke would unleash his verbal violence on the family. Now, my parents have lived here since before I was born, and they would often say that they had never heard this family fight, and they always seemed like really great people. Well, not before long, the verbal fights became too much, and then one night, in the middle of the night, Zeke's wife left with the children, and I don't really remember all the details. I just remember staring out of my bedroom window as Zeke yelled at them to get out and never come back while he held a baseball bat in his hand. I remember being scared, but I couldn't look away. The woman got in the car with the 2 girls, and they left. As they drove off, Zeke walked back into the room that was directly adjacent to my bedroom window, and he sat in a chair facing the wall. As I grew up, this is where Zeke spent most of his time. No TV or no radio, at least that I could see. He would sit in this yellow room and stare at the yellow walls. He would sometimes drink beer, sometimes he would cry, and sometimes he would appear to be talking, but most of the time, he just sat there, as still as a statue. Fast forward to the time of the story, and it was the middle of the summer. Most of my friends were going on some beach trip, but I was broke and I had no job, so I was staying home. One night I was sitting on my porch, and Zeke came over to me. Probably the first conversation I've had with a man in 15 to 20 years. He told me that he had won some contest and that he won a free couple nights stay at some private resort in the mountains. He asked if I would watch his cat and just make sure the house was okay. He told me he would pay me, so of course I accepted. He gave me a key and told me that the cat food was on the counter and that I couldn't miss it. He told me to come over at 6 p.m. and to use the back door because nobody uses the front door anymore. I found it super weird that he didn't physically show me where the food was or even introduce me to the cat or anything. He just gave me the key and left. But I guess I just figured he's a miserable man and that's how he is. 6 p.m. I showed up at his house and walked to the back door like I was directed. The backyard was disgusting and not how I remembered. The pool had no water in it and was filled with half dirt and half murky liquid. Grass was either dead or super overgrown in spots. There was trash and broken lawn furniture everywhere. I walked into the house and the smell was horrible. It smelled like rotten meat. It was seriously repulsive, but I guess people who don't know was blind to certain smells. When you walked through the back door, you walked into a long hallway. There were 2 rooms to the left and 2 rooms to the right. The first 2 on the left were the 2 little girls' rooms. It was haunting and a little sad because the rooms looked untouched. There were still toys on the floor and clothes folded on the dresser. One of the rooms had a board game on the ground that looked like it was in mid-game. The first room on the right was the master bedroom. There was a king bed that wasn't made, but hadn't looked slept in years. Again, the room just looked abandoned. There were clothes, including what I imagined were his ex-wife's clothes, on the dresser, all folded. The second room on the right had a shut door, but a light shining underneath the doorway. I opened the door, and it was the yellow room that I could see from my bedroom. But I could barely concentrate on the room because when I opened the door, I was almost knocked out by the smell. And there was also a major chill when I opened up the door. It was like opening the door to a walk-in cooler. I shut the door and made my way to the kitchen and the living room that was at the end of the hall. All my friends were partying on some beach, and I was in this disgusting and depressing house, regretting my choice to help Zeke. I found the cat dish and the cat food, but no sight of any cat. I poured the food in the dish and just tried to take in my surroundings. The kitchen looked like a bomb exploded. Garbage and trash were everywhere. It was clear that Zeke really gave up on life, but I figured it wasn't my place to judge. While I was looking at the train wreck of a kitchen, I couldn't shake this feeling of wanting to go back and look at the yellow room. I made my way back down the hall to shut the door. It was the weirdest thing to explain, but suddenly the smell didn't bother me anymore. And I didn't even notice the cold. When I opened up the door, I could feel the cold blast my face, but like I said, it didn't bother me. The room was weird. There was a brown wooden chair in the middle of the room, just facing the wall. The bottom of the wall had a small vent that had some burn marks on the side of it. I can't explain why, but I just stood and stared at the vent for a few minutes. I finally broke my stare and looked around the room. There were scratch marks all over the hardwood floors. They were most prevalent in the opposite corner of the room. Also in the corner was the bat that I saw him holding all those years ago when his family left and never came back. My heart began to sink because I thought I could hear voices down in the basement through the vents. It was the strangest feeling I had ever had. I started to focus on the vent again, trying to hear what the voices were saying. They sounded muffled, but they were clearly voices. It sounded like a woman. Maybe I have seen one too many movies, but the first place that my mind went was that this man had his family trapped in the basement. I finally broke my trance in the yellow room and wanted to investigate the basement. When I turned to leave the room, I noticed that the door was shut. And I know I didn't shut the door. Officially freaked out and still on edge about the voices, I kicked open the door and made my way to the basement door, which was off of the kitchen. I almost passed out when I ran by the clock in the kitchen and saw that it was after 3 o'clock in the morning. I got there at 6 p.m. and it only felt like a few minutes went by. Somehow, I blacked out a huge chunk of the night. I didn't try to explain what was happening, I just needed to save the people that were in the basement. And at least that was my thought. There was a giant pile of trash that was blocking the door. I kicked it all down trying to get to the doorknob. After some struggle, I got to the knob and forced the door open. It was freezing. Even more freezing than the house and the yellow room. I could smell that horrible smell again, and the voices were even louder. I turned on the light, ran downstairs, and yelled, "Does anybody need any help?" And there was nobody down there. It was empty. After a moment, the only light that was down there blew out, and I was left with just a little bit of illumination through the basement windows from the streetlights. With the orange glow, I could see some kind of silhouette in the back of the room. I asked if it needed any help in a really tentative voice, and the large, dark shadow grew and started to move toward me. I screamed and I just ran. As I ran up the stairs, I heard a growl and what sounded like hissing. I made my way up the stairs and was running down the long hallway that seemed to last forever. I could again hear the muffled voices that I had heard earlier. That's when I saw the single most terrifying thing that I had ever seen in my entire life. I got to the back door and I turned around briefly before shutting the door, and that's when I saw it. I saw a gigantic, pitch-black entity of some kind at the end of the hall. It looked like it had a bright white face and blacked-out eyes, surrounded by what I could only call a black mass. I turned and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't run back home, I just kept running. I ran all the way to the local 24/7 market, and I sat on the park bench until the sun rose that morning. I went home and hugged both my parents. I didn't explain to them what happened, and I'm sure they wouldn't believe me anyway. I have no history of mental episodes or even vivid nightmares. I can't explain what happened that night. The positive thing that came from this story was that it made me change my life around. I took this as a sign and I went back to school, and I'm actually on track to graduate next year. I took 2 jobs after this event so I could afford my own apartment, and I wouldn't have to look at that yellow room anymore. Perhaps the most terrifying thing is that Zeke never came back to that house after the night he left. My parents tried calling the police, but he ended up just staying missing. They found his car, but they never found any sign of him. I'm not even sure if his ex-wife and daughters were ever notified. I wouldn't even begin to know how to reach them. The house remains there, boarded up, and I hope it remains locked and boarded up. Forever. Anybody who has ever camped in the Adirondack area of upstate New York knows just how breathtaking and beautiful it can be this time of year. Last summer, I stayed with my family in a cabin that rested in the mountains. I had recently split up with my longtime girlfriend, and it seemed like a wonderful place to go to clear my head. At first, my theory was correct. It was therapeutic and beautiful being out in nature and spending time with my family. One of the really nice things about this cabin was that it was truly separated from any other residence. The closest cabin or campsite was probably at least a mile or more away. This meant that we had total and complete privacy. Or so we thought. One late afternoon, probably around 5, we heard some shuffling coming from the front of the cabin. We were sitting on the back porch and just heard some movement that sounded like footsteps. A little on edge, my brother and I got up and got ready, just in case we needed to leap into action. All of a sudden, 2 middle-aged men walked into the back from where we were sitting. I asked in a very abrasive and annoyed voice, "Hey, what are you doing? Can I help you with something?" The men just looked, laughed, and in a cheery voice said, "Why, hello, young man. My name is Louis, and this is Tito. We just really wanted to check the place out. We heard it had a great view, and we just heard so many wonderful stories." I mean, the man seemed sincere, but something just didn't seem right to me. I still looked at them with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. But my mom, who was a very friendly person, made small talk with the man. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about this entire interaction was the friend, Tito, who was just standing around, looking at the house with no facial movements or anything. Louis was charismatic, smiled a lot, and made eye contact, whereas Tito was almost the complete opposite. After several minutes of small talk, we vanished back into the place. I was not a fan of that at all, and quickly let my family know about it. Where were these guys coming from, I thought? As I stated previously, the closest place was about a mile or so away, and that place belonged to the guy who owned the cabin we were staying in. So Louis and Tito must have been hiking for a little while just to get to our cabin. Which is not really unlikely for the Adirondacks, but something didn't feel right about the entire action. It bothered me all night. Around 11, my family went to bed, and I sat around the fire with my brother and his fiancée. Every little noise I heard caused me to jump. These strange guys bothered me more than I even realized. My brother told me not to worry about it, and that I was just worrying too much over nothing. I pretended everything was okay, but I knew deep down inside of me that something wasn't right. Shortly after midnight, it was just my brother and me around the fire. We decided to let the last few logs burn out before we went in. This is when Louis decided to pay us another visit, and this time, he was not so friendly. My brother and I jumped out of our chairs and were now facing Louis and Tito, who were coming out of the woods. They looked crazy. Louis did not have that same charming personality as before, and was now almost deranged in his look. His eyes were bugging from his head, and he flashed his pearly white teeth in an almost sadistic way. Tito, who was almost a statue earlier in the day, stood next to Louis, also smiling, and slowly started to approach me and my brother. As Louis approached us, he said,
"This cabin is really lovely, and I think we'll be staying here now."
He reached into his bag as if to pull something out. Tito, who was slightly behind him, was already wielding some sort of bushwhacking sword. Not trying to take any chances as to what Louis was pulling out of the bag, my brother decided to tackle the man. He went down with relative ease. As Tito approached my brother with the sword, I ran over and pushed him, strictly only using adrenaline as my motivator. Both men got up and backed away. Louis was now standing about 10 feet away, and he just kept saying,
"You have no idea who I am and who you're messing with. I built this house. This is my land."
After repeating this a couple of times, Tito finally spoke up as well, and in an almost robotic voice he said, "We shall have our land back. We must wait for the right time." Tito grabbed the shoulder of Louis, and they both ran into the woods. Remember, this is after midnight in the woods. It was pitch black other than a slightly dim light from the dying fire. He put the fire out rather quickly and went inside of the cabin and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. My brother and I stayed up all night and basically watched the property to make sure they did not come back. I have never been so happy to see the sun in my entire life. The next day we went to see the property owner and told him about the entire night. He said he had never heard the two names before and assured me that no Louis ever built the house. The owner, whom we were renting the cabin from, told us that he built the cabin 10 years ago. So, who were these two that claimed to be the ones that built the cabin? We reported the invasion and then left. The owner was kind enough to refund us the rest of the nights we were supposed to stay at the cabin. I know this could have ended much worse for us. All things considered, I'm very lucky that I left with no more than some minor psychological damage. If we did not go into fight mode right away, who's to say what would have happened? I count my lucky stars every day that I'm alive to tell this story. It may not be scary to some of you who read this, but put yourself in the pitch black forest with these two crazy men and weapons, and I'm sure you'd be scared too. Be safe, everyone, and always lock your doors. You never know who could be creeping around outside right now. I want to first preface this story by saying that you can never judge a book by its cover. I still have not quite recovered from the events that took place on that late summer evening several years ago. I live in a fairly large farmhouse, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. There was almost no traffic or any other people for most of the year. That is, until the last 2 weeks of summer. Every summer my hometown hosts this summer fest, where there is a ton of music and food, and its location is just down the road from my farmhouse. All day and night I hear loud music, the commotion of people, fireworks, and just about anything else you can think of. Most nights I'll usually just sit outside, listen to the music from the festival, and watch people walk away from my property to get to their cars, which are parked in a field about 100 yards or so down from my house. The Summerfest is a big deal where I live, so parking fills up fast, and people park all the way down by my usually quaint street. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for me to have some drunk patrons of the festival on my front lawn. They are almost always harmless and end up walking down the street just a few minutes later. As a result of the proximity to the festival from my house, I have a very good relationship with the sheriff, who I've only had to call once or twice for nothing serious, but just loitering. Well, this year was no different. Every night I sat outside and watched the people leave the event. Men and women of all ages were filled with glee from the exciting time they shared at the concerts that night. On the last night of the festival, around midnight, the last of the lights were being shut down, and the people were walking by my home became smaller and smaller. I was getting ready to go inside for the night when I saw one final group of people walk by my house. They were probably in their mid-20s if I had to guess, and it just seemed rather loud and boisterous, which was not uncommon for this hour of the night. The group of people was not what bothered me though. It was who was following the group of people that gave me a slight pause, and a little bit of a distance, maybe 10 feet or so, was another woman. From a distance in the dark, she looked pretty, but a bit off. She was wearing a pink dress and had blonde hair about shoulder length. When she got parallel to my door, she stopped in the middle of the road and turned her entire body to face my house. I stood and stared back for a moment, but then she turned back to the road and kept walking, now probably about 20 feet from the rest of the people. It was freaky, honestly, but nothing too scary, really. I thought maybe it was just some young girl who perhaps had a little bit too much fun, if you know what I mean, and just got lost looking at my house. As I said before, it's a fairly large home with really high and pointed rooftops. I didn't let the girl in pink bother me for much longer than a few minutes. I got ready for bed, as I usually do, and went upstairs where my bedroom was located. My bedroom overlooked the front of the house, so I could see the road, and just as I was going to lie down, out of my bedroom window, I saw the girl in pink standing in the middle of the road facing my home. Now, this is where I felt a little bit uneasy. I jumped over my dresser and called the sheriff, but he didn't answer. Luckily, I had his personal cell, so I sent him a text message just to alert him that there was a strange young woman from the festival standing outside of my house. Now, clearly at this point she wasn't doing anything wrong or even on my property, but I just had a bad feeling and wanted my friend to check it out. When I looked back out the window, she was gone. And no sooner after I looked up out of the window, I heard a loud bang downstairs. I was crippled and I had sprung from my bed to the top of the staircase and saw that my front door was wide open, with nothing but the moonlight shining in. I heard giggles and the light footprints of someone running on their toes. I could not believe that someone was actually in my house. I tried to sneak down the stairs quietly and make a run for the door, and as I got to the bottom step, I heard a loud and unnerving voice.
Hey, where do you think you're going?
I turned, and only got a quick glimpse. It was the girl in pink. She was standing slightly hunched over with both hands behind her back as if she was concealing something. She was smiling, and I could hear a low giggle, barely audible through her teeth. I turned almost immediately and ran out the front door. To my absolute horror, she was right behind me, running with one arm waving frantically and the other still concealed behind her back.
I'm coming for you,
she said, with her insidious and terrifying voice. I ran several yards down the road with her right on my tail, and thankfully my sheriff friend had received my text message, because with almost no time to spare, he pulled up beside me. Not fazing this girl at all, we both kept running. My sheriff friend got out of his vehicle and tackled the girl into the grass on the side of the road, and then called for backup. The young woman could not remember her name. She kept telling the cops that she lived there and that I had broken into her home. The most terrifying thing about all of this is that still to this day, the woman has no confirmed identity. She had no ID when they found her. She did not know her name, her age, where she was from. All she claimed was that she lived in the house. She was taken to a hospital of some kind where she's being taken care of. It's so scary to me that this woman came from the festival in her nice pink dress and intended on causing me harm with no other backstory. It scares the heck out of me that nobody knows where she came from that night. There were no missing person reports, nothing. This woman came out of nowhere, and it just goes to show you that anybody, anywhere, can cause you harm. I have seen and read a lot of stories on the internet, and I was always very quick to dismiss them as fake. After the experience I had in putting this into writing, I can now see that many of these stories can definitely be true. Life really is stranger than fiction sometimes. My experience seemed so unreal and unlikely to happen, and yet it did happen, and it was truly the most horrific experience of my entire life. To protect my hometown and everybody involved, I'm going to change the names of the people in this story. The night started like any other typical summer night, and I gathered with my friends. It was late in the summer season, and my hometown holds a pretty big fair to cap off the end of the summer festivities. I attended the fair with my two best friends, Kevin and Jeff. Once arriving at the fairgrounds, we decided to meet up with my girlfriend Jamie and our two friends, Amanda and Jill. We were having a blast, eating food, checking out the local items for sale at the tents, listening to music, and walking around just taking in the environment. Something about the fair brings out some strange people, and this was evident when we came across a homeless-looking man dressed as a clown. This almost creature-looking man with hanging skin, a red rubber nose, and a clown wig came from behind us. He grabbed my friend Kevin and asked for some spare change. It was harmless, honestly, but just kind of gave our entire group a jump. After creating a nice distance away from the homeless clown man, we decided to take a break from walking and laugh off the entirely wild and weird situation. That is when we noticed a man in the distance. He was wearing a red mask, black hood, jeans, and some work boots. And most frighteningly was that he was holding an axe of some kind. It's important to note that at this point we were on the midway of the fair, which contained tons of rides and games as far as you could see. So even though this man gave me some pause, I was not really concerned because there were fun houses and haunted house attractions all over this section of the fair. A few minutes later we decided to do some rides so each one of us could have some alone time with our dates. It was nice for a moment until I noticed the red-masked man again. We were on one of those old-fashioned wooden roller coasters when I noticed the man was standing behind the attraction. As soon as the ride ended, I kind of made a dash towards the exit of the ride. Kevin and Jeff were kind of annoyed and finally yelled for me to stop. Several yards away from the roller coaster, I told the group about the red-masked man and how I wanted to tell some type of fair security, just to see if this man was in fact part of the fair. The group laughed and told me to calm down. They pointed to one of the haunted houses, and a zombie stood outside scaring people in line. A few more exhibits down was a fun house where a killer clown was messing with the guests. They told me to relax and that the Axeman had to be part of the fair. I agreed and went back to trying to have a good time with my friends. Toward the end of the night, we were just getting ready to leave and head back to Jamie's house for some night swimming when Jeff wanted to get some ice cream. We agreed to stop on the way out. While Kevin, Jeff, Amanda, and Jill waited in line, me and Jamie sat off to the side and just people watched until Jamie's face turned ghost white. Once I noticed her expression changed, I turned and noticed that the Axeman was standing in the distance. I decided no more games, and I ran after the man. Full speed, I chased him through one of those animal tents, but due to the exuberant amount of people, I lost him. When I ran after him and he fled, that almost gave me some solace that this man was in fact just part of the fair, and he was messing with us the entire night. I wish this is where my horror story ended. A few hours later, we were still at Jamie's, sitting around the fire. It was just the six of us enjoying some conversation and laughter. Our bliss suddenly turned into panic when we heard some shuffling through the forest that sits directly behind Jamie's house. We stopped talking and stared into the thick, dark trees. All we could hear was the crackling of the fire and the stillness of the night as we stared into the dark void. And then out of the darkness was the Axeman in his red mask. He ran full speed out of the forest, axe in hand. The expressionless red mask gave the axeman an even more petrifying and menacing appearance. This could not be happening, we thought as we ran. The house was too far away, so we ran into the pool house, which was just a small little room which had all the pool toys and chemicals for the pool. We tried screaming for help, but like every cliche out there, Jamie truly did live in the middle of nowhere, and all of our cell phones were in the house with our clothes, since we were only wearing our bathing suits. I arrived at the pool house first and opened the door. I just about pushed everyone in and made my way in last, and just as I tried to shut the door, the man threw down his axe and sliced the top of my arm. I was grimacing in pain as I was able to grab the door and shut it and lock it. The man beat on the door like a horror movie villain. We screamed and cried, but by some luck, Jamie had a landline phone in the small pool house, and we dialed 911. The axeman must have heard the conversation because he immediately stopped trying to break down the door. We peered out the window and noticed that the axeman was standing there, facing the door but not moving. His black eyes stared out of the red mask, wielding his axe with two hands. He then lifted the axe and overhead threw it at the door, and then just stood there. After a couple of seconds, he removed the mask, and he was not a he at all, but a she. The deranged axe-wielding lunatic was a beautiful woman. She had makeup running down her face, as if she had been crying all night long. She fell to her knees and began to scream and cry. The emotions we all felt in this moment were almost indescribable. That is when I noticed Jeff looked like he was going to be sick. The woman with the axe was his ex-girlfriend from college, whom we had never met. He was in shock and was at a complete loss of words. No sooner after this revelation did the cops show up and promptly arrested the axe woman. We all gave our statements and then somehow went back to our lives. I know writing this story just how ludicrous it all sounds, how it may be a stretch for some of you to believe the story, but I know the fear I felt that night will never be matched, starting with the uneasiness from the fair, followed by the full-on panic I felt when she chased us from the forest. I will never forget the emotions I felt that night. My advice to everyone, if something does not seem right, chances are you're right. And please just say something. If I would have gone to the fair security when I first saw the axe wielder, this night may have been avoided. Always be aware of the strangeness around you. So, this story is a bit unsettling and weird, more than just your typical scary story. The events of this summer night I did not really consider scary until years later, when I really reflected on the night. I'm 30 years old now, but was only 15 during the events of this strange night. The events started fairly normal, a bunch of high school kids just hanging out, thinking we were cool. It was a group of about 10 of us, if I remember correctly. We decided to post up toward the back of the beach where they were having some type of summer firework night. We honestly were decent kids and were just talking, laughing, telling jokes, and trying to impress the girls. During our time hanging out in the back, we were approached by a very strange-looking man. He was an average height, a little thick in the belly, almost like a beer belly, bald but sporting the hair ring, very patchy facial hair, and just horrible skin. He approached us with great confidence, and he said in a stern voice, "You guys waiting for the ship as well?" Thinking this was more comical than scary, we kind of just laughed and responded with, "The ship? What are you talking about?" The man smiled and flashed his disgusting yellow teeth. Again, in his confident voice, he said, "Yeah, the ship from space. Are you guys here to board it as well?" Well, being kids, we just thought that this was a major joke. We laughed hysterically and just thought that this guy had a lot to drink, or something along those lines. After we composed ourselves, we finally responded to the crazed man by saying, "Where's the ship going?" He responded confidently, "The Andromeda Galaxy, of course." That was the last straw for us. We were just about hunched over in pain, we were laughing so hard. Well,
The man finally realized that we were laughing at him, and he changed his tune real quick. The confident voice suddenly became faint, and the man said, "Go ahead and laugh at me. When they come, you will see." We basically responded by saying whatever and decided to step away from this crazy guy. But the guy started to follow us, and now he was irate. He basically chased us and was telling us about the aliens. Finally, after a few minutes of this and a lot of stares from the people at the beach, I turned around and said in my blunt 15-year-old voice, "Dude, leave us alone. We don't want any part of your ships or aliens." Still treating this as a joke, but more annoyed and creeped out than anything else, we just kept walking. The man finally yelled, "Stop!" We all turned and looked at the creepy UFO man, and he said, almost in tears now, "I've seen you in my dreams. You've been on the ship with me. They chose us." Officially creeped out now. I pushed the guy down, who surprisingly went down like he weighed nothing. When he was on the ground, he just sat there and laughed. With all the commotion, we noticed a lot of people at the beach forming a circle around us, as if we were going to fight. The crazy man got up and started to walk around in a circle of people that formed, and started to ask them in an almost desperate voice now, "Are any of you going up? They'll be here soon. We need to get ready." And the poor deranged man was met with tons of laughter. I started to actually feel bad for him. It seemed like the poor guy really was suffering from some sort of crazy delusion. While the man was interrogating the other people nearby, we used that opportunity to make our way to the parking lot. Honestly, we were done with this guy. It was just starting to get concerning, and we really didn't want any trouble. And once we got to the parking lot, we waited by the main road where my mom was going to pick us up along with my 3 friends. Since she wasn't there yet, we just waited by the entrance of the lot until my mom got there. And disturbingly, across from the lot in a heavily wooded area, we saw the creepy alien man just standing there, staring at us. We did not say anything or provoke him this time. We just watched and waited anxiously for my mom. As we stood there, we noticed that the man just kept pointing up to the sky. He did not look like he was saying anything, but we would not have been able to hear him if he was, because he was probably about 50 yards away. He was making these strange movements as well. It was just deeply, deeply disturbing. In the distance, we finally saw my mom driving up in our green Windstar van. As we approached the door of the van, we noticed that the man was now somewhat rapidly approaching us. Not running, but walking briskly, I would say. We started to move fast, not really knowing if this guy was dangerous or not. And as I got into the passenger side of the van, the man waved from the side of the road, and I just barely heard him say, "I'll see you up there," as he smiled awkwardly at the man. It was not till years later when I was telling this story that I realized just how off and disturbing it really was. We had no idea if this guy could have caused us harm, if he was insane, or if by some crazy chance there was truth to his delusion. I often used to wonder what happened to that guy. I never saw him again. I still attend that beach every year, and honestly, I always go back to that spot at the back of the park to see if the strange man ever comes back. Either way, it was a very strange and interesting story I really wanted to share. It just makes you wonder what happens in some people's heads, and what they think they see. The last few years have been tough on everybody, and it's been a strange adjustment for a lot of people. Many jobs have changed how they operate, and this is both a blessing and a curse. Unfortunately for me, this change was a curse. Something that seemed like it was going to be the greatest news I have received in a long time ended up being a horrific nightmare that I'm lucky to be able to walk away from. And when the world was going through its struggle, I made the choice to go back to school at 30 years old to study video game design. I figured since life was morphing to a more online setting, this would be the perfect chance for me to go back and get my degree. In almost no time at all, I realized how much I loved this program, and how much of a knack I had for game design. I fell in love with programming, designing, and all the boring stuff that game design entails, like game documentation. I got my bachelor's degree in an accelerated program in just over 2 years, and then the job hunt started. By this point, the workforce was back in action, but the online workforce was still very strong and growing, as remote work seemed to be more popular than ever. I applied for dozens of jobs, but the competition in this industry is fierce, and I did not get a call back or even an email back on any of the applications. That is until about 3 months or so after my graduation, when I got an email from a game studio called Eye of the Rose Studios. They were a smaller startup company looking for fresh graduates to bring their unique vision to the company. I did not care that they had no titles launched at this point, and I was kind of attracted to the fact that they were this new company and that they wanted me. One of the other things that seemed really sweet about this gig was the fact that I could work remotely until the company was a bit more known. This was the perfect situation for me at the time. I could work from home, on my own time, get paid by this company, and make a name for myself all at once. Life was finally looking up for me. I had a professional Zoom interview with a man who said his name was Luke Delphine. Mr. Delphine was blown away by my portfolio, and he seemed fascinated in my ideas and everything that I had to say. It's important to note that at this point, there were literally no alarm bells going off whatsoever. The man in the Zoom call was clean cut, wearing a suit, and was sitting in a room where the background was filled with gaming PCs. He seemed knowledgeable about the business and presented himself as a real player within the gaming industry. After the Zoom interview, we chatted casually for a while about our favorite games and gaming mechanics. Part of me thought that this may still have been part of the interview, so I kept my professional attitude and demeanor on full display. After the long call, Luke finally said that he would be in touch with all of the job information, including payments, start date, hours, and all that fun stuff, so keep checking my emails. I was over the moon about this job. I got along so well with this Luke guy, and it seemed like someone I could love to work with. I told my parents and my friends about the job, and I couldn't wait to start. But, unfortunately, waiting was my life for the next 2 weeks. I was anxious, and after the first week I sent Luke some messages, and I never heard back. It was discouraging and frustrating, and I didn't know what to do. Just as I was about to lose hope, I finally got an email from someone who was not Luke, but said that they worked for the Eye of the Rose, so I opened the email. The message looked fake, like spam, but I wanted so much for this job and everything to be real, so I read the entire email. It wanted all of my personal information, like my address, phone number, bank information for direct deposit, and then just some random questions like, do I live alone? Do I have children or pets? Just questions that seemed like they didn't belong. After I sent the message back, which I know was a huge mistake, but this working online stuff was all new to me, I did not receive an email back until the next day, and the response to the email was just, great, thanks. It was not signed by anybody, and didn't even leave the company name attached. This is where I finally started to get that pit in my stomach. That, oh boy, what did I do type feeling. Another 5 days goes by, and I hear nothing. I was messaging that email and Luke's email and still heard nothing. I started to panic and was constantly checking my bank account, but the low dollar amount that was in there was left alone. That night outside of my apartment, I heard a loud bang. It would have woken me up, but I was already awake gaming on my PC. I heard the bang again, and then again. I had all the lights off, and my room was only illuminated by my computer screen. I left the spare bedroom where my computer was located, and made my way to the dark living room. The loud banging had now turned to the sound of shuffling. I stared at the sliding glass door, which was concealed by the hanging blinds, so I couldn't see what was on the other side. It sounded like there was someone on my balcony. I live on the second floor, so it wouldn't be impossible for someone to climb up there, but it also wouldn't be easy. I've heard the movement of big birds or even big raccoons, but this was bigger, whatever it was. After a brief pause, which seemed like an eternity, the sound was now unmistakable. Someone was trying to break into my sliding door. I was frozen in fear. My phone was in my pocket, and all I had to do was call the authorities, but at that moment, all I could think to do was hide. I tried to tiptoe away from the door to the hallway, and that's where the second nightmare hit me. There was someone turning my doorknob to my front door as well, not just the sliding door. In the bedroom there was a bathroom, and I was able to fit inside the small closet inside the bathroom. Finally, logic kicked in, and I remembered my phone was in my pocket, and I called the authorities. I whispered the situation to them, and in my mind I felt like I was screaming, even though the dispatch operator could barely hear me. Moments after I gave the address, I heard the front door squeak open. I had the operator on the phone the entire time, and I just clenched my phone, hoping that the police would show up soon. The footsteps were soft and slow. I could feel his footsteps through the vibrations on the floor as he made his way to the sliding door. The intruder opened the sliding door, and it sounded like more than one person came in through the slider. I could hear some muffled whispers, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The slow footprints continued as the intruders searched the room. They got to the bedroom, and once they realized I wasn't in there, they turned the light on. I could literally not breathe at this point, and I was terrified that my shaking would give my location away. One of the intruders entered the bathroom and turned the light on. I was crippled at this point. There was no movement for several seconds, and I began to fear the worst. I almost screamed when the intruder drew back the shower curtain. The loud noise of the curtain rod sounded like a blast from a trumpet. The intruder sighed, and then grabbed the doorknob of the small closet I was hiding in, but he didn't open it for some reason. The only reason I can think of is he must have thought that the closet was too small for any adult to fit in. This was the first time in my life I was happy to be a very below average sized man. As the tension was at an all-time high, I heard a knock at the apartment door. "Hello, police. Is everything okay in here?" The intruder that was in the bathroom spoke up calmly and said, "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" I heard the conversation that transpired next, and I was in disbelief at the calmness of this man. The police officer said, "There was a call about an intruder. Is this your apartment, sir?" The man responded, "Yeah, sorry about that, officer. I really spooked myself out. I thought I heard someone on the balcony, but it was just a possum. I'm so sorry I wasted your time." There was a brief pause, and one of the cops must have thought something wasn't right because he asked if he could look around. The intruder seemed a bit nervous now, but responded with an uneasy okay. As soon as I heard the cop enter the bathroom, I cracked open the door and made myself known. The cop motioned for me to go back into the closet and went back into our living room and instantly arrested the man. I came out and told the officer that there were 2 more guys at least, and as I said that, 2 guys bursted out of the coat closet and ran for the door. One of the cops ran after him as the other radioed for backup. After undoubtedly the worst night I'd ever had, it was finally starting to feel a bit safer. For a little while anyway. They were able to catch one of the intruders that fled, but the other one escaped, and his 2 accomplices have yet to turn him in. The main intruder that pretended to be me was none other than Luke, and I did not recognize the other intruder that the cops arrested. This same night I went home and lived with my parents, and I never stayed another night in that apartment. I have no idea what these men intended to do to me. Attack me, rob me, or worse. One very ironic detail, and one that I found humorous after all this was said and done, was the fact that I typed my account number for my bank account wrong, so they couldn't access my account, and that's why my account remained untouched. I apologize for the long story, but I believe it's important to do your research when you're applying for a new job, especially online, and never, ever give out your personal information until you know for sure that the job is legit. People are sick and twisted, and you never know what kind of evil and atrocities they are capable of until you find yourself on the other side of a terrible incident. I remember being a teenager and really enjoying those first few weeks of summer break. Sleeping in, staying up late, hanging out with friends, and basically just enjoying life. One night though, I will forever remember, but for all the wrong reasons. Here's a story about potentially the most traumatic night of my entire life. It was a normal summer night like most nights, but on this specific night, my parents were out of town for their anniversary. My friend James was coming over for the night, and my brother, who was 20 at the time, was going to be there to look after us because it was only one night. Well, around 1 a.m., James just happened to look out of the window, and there were 2 people standing in the middle of the road, and they appeared to almost be looking right at us. We told my brother, who then decided to look. We couldn't be sure, but it looked like they were taking pictures of the house. So my brother, who really doesn't take any crap, went outside and yelled at the 2 from the front steps. It was a man and a woman, probably in their late 20s, I would guess. The man didn't say anything, but the woman said, "Oh, we're sorry. We're just trying to take some pictures of the moon. It really is beautiful." My brother said he didn't care, and they needed to leave right now. She then insisted that he come down there and look at the moonlight, and then he would understand. After a brief verbal scruffle, my brother then said, "If you guys don't get off my property, I'm going to make you." And he started to approach the couple. Once my brother got to the street, the man who was with the woman struck him in the back of the head. James and I just sat there in disbelief. We didn't know what to do. Clearly, we were only young teenagers, and this guy was beating up my brother. James called the police and explained what was happening. I was in a panic, worrying if my brother was okay. I looked again, and the man was still kicking it, and the woman just sat there and laughed. I covered my eyes, and that's when I heard her yell, "Run!" My neighbor from across the street ran out with a baseball bat. He didn't hit the man, but he did try. They ran off quickly, and they were out of sight in a moment. The man helped my brother up and helped him to the door. The cops showed up a few minutes later, and we gave our statement. Of course, there was nothing that really could be done because none of us got a good look at the face, and there really was no other proof. Whoever these people were, they had a plan all along. Writing this as an adult, I still get a sick feeling in my stomach every time I walk on a cool summer night. The events that take place during this story are over the course of a few nights. But before we get there, I need to provide a bit of backstory. My husband and I had just moved to New York City. I mean, right in the heart of the city. The apartment was breathtaking. It was like one of those apartments you would see in a movie or a television show. My husband was fortunate enough to land this high-paying job, so that is how we could afford this beautiful apartment. At night, you could see all the lights from the city out of the windows. It was truly a sight to behold. It did not take long for my husband to make some friends at work. He is a very social person, and people just objectively seem to like him. Almost a year into living in the city, we had our weekend crew for the most part. We would have dinner, play games, or just drink wine with another couple, Becky and Jim, as well as another couple, Jason and Liz. But perhaps my husband's best friend was a man named Eric. Eric did not have a significant other, but never came alone. He always had a girlfriend he would bring. He would always joke with me and my husband, "Don't worry guys, you never have to worry about me being the third wheel." And this was always the joke with our friend group. Eric the Third, we would call him as a joke because he was constantly calling himself a third wheel. One night after one of our get-togethers, my husband and I were getting ready for bed. We talked for a while, but ultimately went right to bed. This was the first night of my worst nightmare. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I didn't look at the time, but it was still dark, so it was before 5 a.m. if I had to guess. I heard a noise, and I know that is what woke me up. I kind of just laid in bed, feeling a bit uneasy. I looked up in the dark room, and I was sure I could see a figure of some kind in the corner of the room. The more I tried to focus, the more scared I got. I felt as if I could almost hear breathing. I chalked it up to some kind of vivid nightmare, and rolled over and went back to bed. I was too scared at the moment to look, and I did not want to wake my husband up for something so stupid, or at least I thought. So the next night came, and same story. We went to bed around 11. I did not tell my husband about the events of the night before. Again, I was woken up in the middle of the night. This time I looked at the time, and it was shortly after 4 a.m. I could for sure hear breathing this time. I looked around the room from the bed, but this time I could not see any figures like I did the night before. I could just hear the breathing, and it felt so close. I tried waking up my husband, but he was unconsciously asleep. I admittedly did not try awfully hard because he had to wake up in about a half an hour or so for work. I did not sleep well the rest of the night. I woke up with him in the morning and did not want to stay in the bedroom when he left. I moved to the living room and slept on the couch for a couple of hours. That day was miserable. I could not shake the feeling the entire day that something was not right. Around 2 in the afternoon I took a shower. When I turned the shower off and was drying my hair in the bathroom, I was sure I heard something in the apartment. I froze in paranoia in the bathroom, and I listened with my ear to the door, but I heard nothing. Finally, I worked up the courage to leave the bathroom, and felt a minor moment of relief when I was, in fact, still alone in the apartment.
Shortly after 5, my husband came home from work, and I told him about the events of the last 2 nights. At first, he laughed as if I were telling him an elaborate joke. After, he could see how scared I was. He then began to try to rationalize what I could have seen and heard. I have to say, I was insulted because he suggested that maybe I had too much to drink, but that was not the case whatsoever. Feeling a slight amount of concern, he said in a reassuring voice, "If it happens again, just wake me up, and I'll search the room." And this actually did give me a bit of peace in my mind. The night came, and I was so tired from the previous night that I fell asleep even though I was still petrified to go to bed. This was the worst night so far. Again, right around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of breathing, and it was undeniable at this point. I looked around the room and saw nothing, just like the previous night. I woke up my husband and told him to listen. He could hear the breathing too. He sprang from the bed and turned on the light. There was thankfully nobody standing in the room. That brief moment of solace ended quickly when the nightmare came true. My husband walked over to the walk-in closet, and emerging from under the bed was our friend Eric. He ran like a man on a mission to my husband, who was now in the closet, and he tackled him. I screamed in a panic. I jumped from the bed and tried to make a run for the door. I was trapped 40 stories high. Eric was an athletic man, and I was not going to outrun him on the stairs, and I surely didn't have enough time for the elevator. I ran towards the door. My plan was to just yell in the hallway until someone hopefully heard me. I did not even make it to the door before Eric had caught me. I screamed as loud as I could, and also had my eyes closed. But thankfully, in that moment, my husband sprang out and tackled Eric. I ran to my cell phone and called the police. My husband's a fairly large man, and he was able to keep Eric down until the cops showed up. And, to their credit, they were there incredibly fast. My husband only had a minor wound on his arm, and a mild concussion from hitting his head. When the cops were arresting Eric, he just kept saying the same line repeatedly. "I didn't want to be the third wheel anymore. I didn't want to be the third wheel anymore." What was most disturbing is that this man was inside of our apartment for days. He had somehow stolen my husband's key and made a copy. He was breaking into the apartment for weeks, but just the last couple of days is when he was in the bedroom while we slept. I'm not sure why he didn't try anything while we were sleeping, or any of the times myself or my husband were alone in the apartment. It still freaks me out thinking that this man was inches from where I slept. We're now back in our hometown and not living in the city anymore. The terror you feel being trapped that high up in the sky, where there's nowhere to run, is extremely claustrophobic. Be careful, anybody who reads this. You never know what people are capable of, even your friends. And please be kind to everyone. Sometimes the words you say can really affect people. Eric has admitted he did not intend to hurt either one of us, but the look in his eyes that night tell a completely different story.
The story I'm about to share happened to me a few years ago now. I cautiously clicked through the listings on Craigslist. I scanned the screen for any affordable baby clothes. Any new parents out there know what I mean when I say preparing for newborns is an expensive and a stressful thing to do. My wife Sarah was due in just a few months, and we were trying to prepare ourselves for an impending arrival of our little one. That's when I stumbled upon an ad that caught my attention. Baby clothes bundle, excellent condition, $50. The ad seemed promising, displaying pictures of various tiny outfits, neatly folded and ready for a new home. I was excited as I reached out to the seller to arrange a meeting. I didn't recognize the street name or even the area where we arranged the meetup, but I was also somewhat new to the area at the time, so I didn't think too much about it. On the designated day, I made my way to the address. I was surprised, and honestly, I thought I may have been at the wrong address at first. The house seemed abandoned, like it had been neglected for a long time. The peeling paint and broken windows created a very unnerving experience. I parked my car a little distance away, and I nervously approached the entrance. My heart was pounding, and I felt a mix of anticipation and, honestly, a little fear. I knocked on the door and it sort of just opened. Inside was a dimly lit room that was casting shadows across decaying walls and furniture. I could hear the floorboards creaking under my weight as I ventured further into the house. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, causing me to freeze in my tracks. The man before me had wild, disheveled hair and bloodshot eyes that darted around the room. He seemed so unsettled. His appearance alone made me uncomfortable, and I instantly started to question my decision to come here. In a quivering voice that sounded like a mix of excitement and almost desperation, the man said, "Are you here for the baby clothes?" Yeah, I am," I replied, attempting to hide the fact that I was terrified. He asked abruptly, "Where's the pregnant woman?" My heart skipped a beat. Something about his question, the way he asked it, gave me a horrible feeling. I mustered up the courage to speak, and in a shaky voice I said, She couldn't make it. She's home." As soon as the words left my lips, the man's demeanor shifted dramatically. His face contorted with anger and frustration, and his breathing became heavy and erratic. He clenched his fist, his knuckles were turning white, and then he abruptly turned and ran towards the exit, leaving me alone in this abandoned house. I stood there, shocked and afraid, trying to process what had just happened. And then I noticed it, an object left behind on the floor. It was a knife that was gleaming in the dim light that was shining through the windows. The realization struck me instantly. Was this deranged man planning to harm Sarah? Were we in actual danger? Panic took over me, and I wasted no time trying to escape the house. As I drove away, my mind raced, as I was thinking about all of the terrifying possibilities. What were the true intentions of that crazed man? When I finally arrived home, I held Sarah close. My heart was still pounding. I did contact the authorities and report the incident, and I tried to provide them all the details that I could recall. From that day forward, I never used Craigslist or even Facebook Marketplace. I love a good deal, but some people are monsters, and that's a risk I don't want to take. To this day, I often wonder what would have happened if Sarah had gone with me. The implications seemed clear. The man's sudden outburst, his escape, the knife left behind. The thought of the potential danger still messes me up when I think about it. Even someone selling something as harmless as baby clothes can turn out to be a terrifying monster. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and cursed objects were nothing more than tales to scare the gullible. And honestly, I still may believe that. Even writing this now, I'm not sure this was anything more than just a coincidence. Either way, I thought it was spooky, and I figured I would share my story and see what people think. The short story I'm about to tell started when I stumbled upon a listing on Craigslist. A supposedly haunted chest from a tomb on the other side of the world. It sounded like a load of nonsense, but there was something about it that intrigued me. Honestly, it just sounded cool, and it sounded like something I wanted to display on my bookshelf as a nice conversation starter. I hesitated for a moment, contemplating the purchase. Not because it was allegedly haunted, but because I would be spending money on someone's junk. But, as I said before, it could be an interesting conversation piece from my collection of oddities. With a smirk on my face, I contacted the seller, and long story short, a few days later I was the proud owner of a weird little chest. The chest was intricately carved, bearing symbols and patterns that hinted at an ancient origin. As I placed it on my shelf, I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of the ghostly presence lurking within. It really was cool. Haunted or not, the chest actually looked old, and I could easily convince people that it was hundreds, if not thousands of years old. However, strange things did start happening. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. I felt like I could hear whispers in the air, and a chill would fill the room at the most unexpected moments. I dismissed it as a series of coincidences and my own overactive imagination playing tricks on me. The nightmares were what truly shook me to my core. Each night, I would be transported to a place of darkness. Unearthly creatures with glowing eyes and grotesque forms would torment me relentlessly. They were so real and unlike any other dreams I have ever had in my life. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, and I'd be thinking about the nightmares for hours after the fact. As days turned into weeks, my once confident skepticism started to fade, and I was replaced by fear and uncertainty. I found myself constantly contemplating the true nature of the chest. Could it be that I had accidentally invited something malevolent into my life? Driven by desperation, or maybe just in case, I made the decision to part ways with the haunted chest. I sold it to a fellow collector, and I was relieved to have it out of my possession. And just as abruptly as the strange occurrences had begun, they stopped. The nightmares vanished, the whispers faded, and the cold air was non-existent. Coincidence? Perhaps. But deep down, I had my doubts, and I always will. I learned a valuable lesson about the power of belief, and that even skeptics can be swayed when faced with some unexplainable events. Since then, I've steered clear of any items with a history or claims of the supernatural. I couldn't find any information on the original seller, so unfortunately, I don't know any of the history from before I had the chest. I guess some mysteries are just better left unsolved. And as for the allegedly haunted chest now, I have no idea. I never contacted the guy I sold it to, and as far as I know, he's completely fine. What do you think? Was the chest cursed? Or did I just let my mind take over and win? This happened to me and my friends over 10 years ago when we were still in high school. It was a rainy Friday night and my friends and I were hanging out at our buddy Mark's house. High school life had its fair share of boredom, and we were desperate for some excitement. Fueled by our mischievous nature, we decided to entertain ourselves by browsing Craigslist for a potential prank victim. And like I said, we were very mischievous. Craigslist is weird. We found all sorts of wild ads, and from those ads we decided to make some prank phone calls, fake some emails, and we reveled in the absurdity of our juvenile mischief. Little did we know that the tables were about to turn, and we were about to realize that we'd messed with the wrong person. As the night wore on, we heard a knock on the door. We rushed to the entrance. It was this weird thrill of excitement and fear because it was after midnight at this point. To our surprise, though, there was no one there. A couple of us went out and searched the porch and the darkened street beyond, but there wasn't a sign of anyone. Shaking it off as just a product of our imaginations, we returned to our gathering, just dismissing the incident as a harmless coincidence. However, as the hours crept by, something didn't feel right. Maybe it was my teenage guilt, but whatever it was, it gave me a pit in my stomach. We decided to crash around 1 in the morning, and that's when we started to hear the unexplainable noises that came from all corners of the house. We could clearly hear whispers coming from the other side of the window. We all tried to be quiet and listen because some of us still thought it was our imagination playing tricks on us. This was a mistake. Whoever was outside the window started to lightly bang on the other side, and we could hear them clearly saying in a whisper, "Hey, I know you're awake." We had no idea what to do. This is before everybody had a cell phone, so we didn't call the police. And honestly, we thought we would get in trouble. The noises stopped eventually, and just when we thought whatever was happening was over, we noticed a note on the outside of the kitchen window. Taped on the note on the glass was just the word, "Gotcha." with a smiley face next to the word. I remember trying to look outside into the streetlights for any sign of a person, but I didn't see anybody. There was no one lurking in the shadows, no trace of an intruder. The realization that we were being watched terrified us. For some reason, we never told any of our parents. We have no idea who pranked us that night. I suppose it could have somehow been someone from Craigslist that night. Or even more terrifying, it could have been a complete stranger. Either way, I learned my lesson after that. I never messed with anyone on Craigslist ever again. And we never made another prank phone call after that either. My advice to anybody reading this, be kind. You never know who you may upset.
Anybody who has ever worked at a fast food restaurant overnight knows just how unique some patrons can be. To add another variable to this already great combination, I worked at a 24-hour McDonald's that was directly off of an exit. So it was a frequent stop for truckers, cops, drunks, and anybody looking to get some hot food in the middle of the night. As you would expect, I met countless characters that I could describe. I could write a book about every strange and unique human I met while working at this job. I've even had some wild experiences with people who decided to have all-out brawls right in the restaurant. But none of these experiences were scary. They were just kind of crazy to witness. Only once in the 2 years that I worked at that restaurant did I experience something that was indeed terrible and horrified me. That specific night started like most nights that I did the overnight shift. I got there at 10 p.m. and it was extremely slow. It was always really slow at that time. And then you would get a rush from about 11:30 to 1:30, and then depending on the day, it would be sporadic throughout the night. On this night, I was hoping for a slow night. It was just one of those days when I wasn't feeling good at all. My car wouldn't start in the morning. My husband tried to figure it out, but unfortunately, cars aren't his strong suit. So I was without a car. On top of that, I felt so under the weather. It happens to me every fall season. I felt like a house fell on me, and I just wanted to get under a blanket and pass out. But unfortunately, I have bills to pay, so unless I was extremely sick, calling in was not an option. Thankfully, I was able to take my husband's Silverado truck to work. A little after 2 a.m., my coworker and I were just hanging out. I ended up getting my wish with it being slow. That night was one of the slowest nights I can remember working. Eventually, my coworker went into the office to do some paperwork. I think that was an excuse to go take a nap, but I didn't have the energy to call him out. When I was alone at the counter, listening to YouTube on my phone, I heard the bell from the door. It was a peculiar-looking man. He wasn't an old man, but he wasn't young either. Maybe mid-40s if I had to guess. He looked homeless, but not grungy and dirty. More like he was just not together right. He was shorter than me, but I'm tall for a woman. He couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds, even with his big winter coat on. As he slowly approached the counter, I asked, "Hey there, sir. What can I get you tonight?" The man just looked at me and smiled. I wish I could have a picture of that moment. The look he was giving me made me so unsettled. Something about the way he looked at me was just not right. It just gave me the creeps before he even spoke. His eyes were so dark, and they looked almost black, and his mouth was just open enough with a smile that I could see all of his yellow teeth. Finally, he spoke. After what seemed like an outrageous amount of time, I was surprised at the deep southern voice that came out from this little man. And he said, "Wow, aren't you gorgeous? I thought I wanted fries, but maybe I'll order something else." Yeah, so I know that's weird and creepy, but working this graveyard shift at a restaurant that gets a lot of customers who are under the influence, I'm used to weird attempts at flirting. So I just smiled and said very politely, "Okay, sir, well, when you know what you want, just let me know." The man now grinned from ear to ear, flashing his full set of yellow and gray teeth. He set his hands on the counter, and all I could see were his long, dirty fingernails. Trying not to look visibly disgusted, he spoke up again and said, "Forget the fries. What time are you out?" Usually something like this, I would just smile and say that I'm married and move on with my life. But I don't know if it was because I didn't feel good, or maybe because this guy gave me the creeps from the start, but instead, in an annoyed and aggressive voice, I responded with,
If you don't want to order any food, you can just leave.
The man started to laugh as if I told him a great joke.
Before I said or did something that I would regret, I turned around and started knocking on the office door. When my coworker opened the door, you could tell I was visibly shaken. I told him about the creepy guy who was clearly in sight, and he smirked because he knew right away what I was dealing with. He told me to go take a break and that he would take care of the guy. Without even thinking or looking back, I grabbed my coat and went outside and sat in my husband's truck for 15 minutes. I listened to some music and just tried to forget about the creep. After my break, I had almost completely forgotten about the creep until right before I went back inside, and I noticed him wandering on the far side of the parking lot with a to-go bag in his hands. I was relieved that my coworker was able to get rid of him, and I decided to wait in the truck for another 5 minutes, just in case. I didn't want this creep to see what vehicle mine was anyway. When I finally got back inside, my coworker looked a little freaked out. I asked him how the interaction with the freak went, and his answer really freaked me out. He said in a tentative voice, "I don't know if I want to tell you." I started to jokingly hit his arm, and I told him to tell me, to which he complied, and he said, "That guy was crazy. When I came out to take his order, he just kept saying, 'Where was the girl? Where did the girl go?' So, I told him that he went home for the night, and he started to lose his mind, screaming and swearing. I ended up giving him a free medium fry just to shut him up and get him out of here. Then he turned around as he was walking out, and he said, 'Tell Monica I said goodbye, and I'll see her soon.'" This little story almost made me faint, mainly because I don't wear a name tag at this job. I had no earthly idea how this man knew my name. For the remainder of the shift, I couldn't focus. I just kept looking over at the door, expecting this man to stumble back in, but thankfully, he never did. Close to 4:30 in the morning, I asked if I could leave early. He knew I wasn't feeling well, and with this creepy guy in my mind, he knew I just needed to get away. Just to make my night more enjoyable, as I was leaving, it started to snow, and it was the first truly hard snowfall of the season, even though fall basically just started. I was thankful to have my husband's truck once again, and I figured if I just took it slow, I'd be safe. I couldn't have been more wrong. Only about a half a mile from work, I ended up driving into a ditch because I couldn't see the road from the snow falling. I was alright, and it didn't seem to do too much damage, but I couldn't get myself out of the ditch. I called the police dispatch, and surprisingly the cops were there in about a minute. I got out of the truck to greet the cop, and that's when it happened. From the bed of the truck, the man from the restaurant jumped out and started to run full speed into the night. I screamed, and then was at a loss of words. The cop didn't know what to do and started to yell at me to tell him what was going on. I finally told him, and he radioed some of the other cops, but they never caught him. We eventually went back to the restaurant, and I gave the police my entire story. They looked at the cameras, but it wasn't enough to catch the guy. The worst part was watching the video of the guy getting into the bed of my truck. It was no more than 10 minutes after my break. He came storming back into the parking lot with the food bag still in his hands. He looked around for a few minutes, tried the door to the truck, and when it was locked, he just jumped back into the truck. I'm so lucky I drove into a ditch that night, because if I hadn't, who knows what would have happened to me. The bag was left in the back of the truck with the fries still in it. This guy never even wanted the food. He knew my name from the start, he knew when I worked, and he knew the vehicle I would have. This happened several years ago, and I'm still not quite ready to work overnights again. Always lock your car doors, and please be careful. Some people really are monsters. In my mid-20s, I was trying to figure out a lot of aspects of my life, and I was trying to get my future in order. I was never objectively a bad person, but somehow I always seemed to fall through the cracks. I finished near the bottom of my class with my GPA. I never went to college, and I experimented with some extracurricular things, you could say. Some things that are probably illegal. I was never in trouble, but I also never brought anything of substance to my life. I was about a month away from my 26th birthday when I met Janelle, and that's when I decided it was time to use my brain and become a decent member of society, instead of just another burnout. Due to my disturbing resume, or lack thereof at this point in my life, I was finding it very hard to find a job. Even jobs you may think anybody can get, I wouldn't even get a call back.
Even if I went out of my way to reach back out to them to follow up on an application, I would still never have my call returned. It hit me hard. Just as I was about to give up, just like I always did, Janelle found me an amazing job. Not glamorous by any means, but for someone like me, it was amazing. The job was for an overnight warehouse worker. I would work from 9 until 6:30 in the morning, loading up pallets with boxes. Though the main premise sounds simple enough, and it was, physically the job was tough. We never had enough help, and it was extremely hard to keep help once we would get the workers in the door. I found myself a lot of the time working alone until finally the company downsized. We started working until 4:30 in the morning instead of 6:30, and the little help that we did have was spread thin. When I was working, I would put headphones on and just get into the zone. I didn't bother talking to anybody or even getting to know anyone because chances are I wouldn't be seeing them in a week or two. And honestly, talking just distracted me, and I was all about getting my job done. One night, I was nearing the end of my shift. I noticed a smaller looking man standing about 5 feet away from me. I didn't say anything at first because I figured it was just a new employee watching how I did things. But when I finished, I took out my headphones and asked the guy if he needed anything, and he responded, "Yeah, man, I hate to ask, but I was wondering if I could get a ride home." I found it weird considering I had no idea who this guy was and didn't even recognize his face as one of the workers. Being the kind guy that I am, I told him that I would for some gas money. He responded almost nervously and said, Yeah, man, of course I got you." I told the guy to give me a few minutes to grab my things and punch out of my shift, and then meet me outside. He nodded and agreed. I felt weird about the situation, but I've been in his shoes before, I kept telling myself. I told one of the other guys when I was punching out that I had to give that weird new guy a ride home, and the other employee made a strange face and asked, "The new guy? I don't remember seeing the new guy." We both shrugged it off, just assuming that's how this place operates these days. I went outside a few minutes later and saw the strange guy waiting next to my car. What I didn't find alarming then, and I wish I would have, was that I never told the guy which car I drove, and yet he was already waiting by my car. We started the drive, and right away things were weird. I asked him where he lived, and he gave me a vague and confusing answer. I live on Maple Drive. Well, no, not anymore. Now I live near the park. Rose Park by the edge of the city." I nodded and said, "Okay, man. Near the park." "Where near the park? I just want to know where I'm dropping you off, dude." The man said nothing for a few seconds, and then said, "Just near the park. Head towards the park, and I'll tell you where to go." I'm still kind of in awe of my stupidity as I write this. You have to understand, at this point in my life, I really didn't care about much and just wanted to get from point A to point B in my day-to-day life. I didn't really question anything. When we got close to the park, the man finally spoke up. "Turn here." I stopped the car for a moment and said to the guy, "Are you sure? This doesn't really look like a street." The man just kept saying, "Yeah," in his shaky voice as he nodded intently. Against my better judgment, I turned down the long, dark path. This was for sure not a road. It was a dirt path, and I couldn't see anything. I turned on my high beams, and thankfully it was just in time. Obstructing the road in front of me was a massive fallen tree. "Whoa, dude, looks like we're gonna have to go another way. I can't get by this tree." The man didn't say anything. I looked over at him, and his hands were now in his hoodie pocket. While I was looking at him, he said, "Get out of the car now." He kept moving his hands inside of his sweatshirt, as if he was trying to grab something he had concealed underneath. But when I looked up out of the windshield, I saw 2 more masked men come from the side of the fallen tree. My heart was racing out of my chest at this point. I didn't know if I was going to get robbed or worse. The man in my car then screamed at the top of his lungs and said, "Get out now!" I slowly started to open the car door and noticed another 2 men behind my car, also wearing masks. When my door was open, I started to step out, and I noticed the man in my car start to get out of the vehicle as well. That's when I made the single most daring decision of my life. As I noticed him clearly outside of the car, I got back into the driver's seat and reversed as fast as I could. Thankfully, he never ordered me to shut the car off, so the car was running this entire time. I may have bumped into one of the potential robbers, or maybe it was a big tree branch. I wasn't sure in the heat of the moment. When I got to the end of the dark path and was putting my car to dry so I could peel off, I looked back one last time and saw all 5 men running after my car. They all appeared to be holding something in their hands, but I didn't bother to find out what they were carrying. I didn't alert the police for some reason. When I got home, I was just so tense and anxious, I just needed to lie down. I called my managers the next day and told them about the incident, to which they replied, "Well, we didn't hire anybody new in the last couple of weeks." I felt sick after hearing that. We looked at the cameras and saw this man basically come out of the shadows when I parked my car for the night shift. He waited by my car for several hours and then went inside. Nobody said anything to this strange guy because help spread so thin, basically nobody even noticed him. He was watching me finish my shift for about an hour when he finally approached me. My manager said that they contacted the police, but I was never questioned, which I found suspicious, leading me to believe that they never actually reported it. To this day, I've never reported it, and honestly, it was so long ago at this point, I'm sure nothing could be done. I only worked there for another month or so after the incident, and I never saw the strange man again. The only good that came from this horrible event was that the company started locking the doors for these overnight shifts, which you may think is obvious, but you'd be surprised at just how relaxed certain businesses are when the managers aren't around. My advice to anybody who reads this: be careful. If something feels weird, chances are you're probably right. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, I found myself picking up the overnight shift at a gas station that was close to home for some extra pay. The gas station was unique. It was one of those full market gas stations nestled in a pretty upscale part of the town. Many stories revolve around the 24-hour setups that are dimly lit and eerie, but this wasn't the case here. It was a comfortable environment to work in. Usually, it would get slow after 11 o'clock, and I would spend most of the night just shifting through YouTube or Netflix on my phone, chatting with my pregnant wife, or stocking the shelves occasionally. We didn't see many overnight truck drivers coming in for coffee or snacks, as we were quite a distance away from the highway. It was an easy job, particularly crucial given my wife's pregnancy, and the pay was good. One night, early in my shift, a tall man came in. I greeted him warmly from behind the counter. "Hello there, how's it going this evening?" But he ignored me, and headed straight into the restroom. And given the urgent nature of some needs, I didn't really find that behavior all too alarming. Almost 20 minutes passed, and he hadn't emerged from the restroom yet. I was becoming slightly concerned and contemplated knocking on the door to check on him. As I started to move towards the restroom, he finally came out. I got a good look at him. Average looking, clean cut with a tan complexion and neatly combed, short gray hair. He looked younger than his hair color suggested, probably not over 40 years old. He wore jeans, a flannel, and worn-out work boots. He seemed like a typical blue-collar worker who had stopped in for a quick bathroom break. Without uttering a word, he walked past me again and headed outside. I noticed he didn't get into a vehicle. Instead, he seemed to walk off towards the side of the building. That's when I realized there was no vehicle. The man must have been on foot, and it seemed a little weird and unsettling, but I didn't dwell on it for too long. Being on the late night shift, I'd encountered a fair share of eccentric individuals. As the night wore on, I ended up calling my wife and we chatted, just to pass the time. About an hour later, the door opened, and surprisingly, it was the same man. This time, I didn't greet him, thinking he might not understand English. This theory quickly was disproven when he approached the counter, asking politely with a smirk, "Hello, sir. You can't say hello to me?" I was startled, and I replied, "Apologies for that, sir. Hello, how are you this evening?" He smiled, and he said in a very aggressive voice, "Jerky." Confused, I asked, "Excuse me?" The man then leaned in, his tone shifting to aggression. "I want beef jerky. Where is it?" I pointed him towards the rack where all the jerky and Slim Jims were. He thanked me politely, and while he walked to the rack, he commented, "You know, you look like a Disney prince." I was taken aback and simply thanked him. I might look like many things, but a Disney prince? Not so much. The man returned to the counter without grabbing any jerky, started staring at me intensely. It felt uncomfortable, his eyes darting like ping pong balls. He then confirmed it and said, "Yeah, that's it. A Disney prince. I can see it now." His excitement seemed weird, but I managed a half smile. This didn't please him, and he began to shout, "What, you don't like Disney?" Before I could even reply, he shouted again, "You know, my son used to like Disney, and now he's just like you." This man clearly wasn't stable. I couldn't decipher what he meant by his son was being just like me. I tried to calm him down. "I'm sorry if I offended you. He cut me off, ranting about nonsense. Fortunately, I had never hung up the phone with my wife, who had been on the line for the entire time. She sensed that something was off, and she called the police, explaining that I was dealing with a potentially dangerous customer. The man began to exhibit extreme aggression by toppling over the beef jerky display. This was the first moment I felt truly threatened. He then turned to me, his eyes devoid of any emotion. Thankfully, 2 police cars pulled up right at that moment. He didn't react. He simply stood there, continuing to stare at me. The officers walked in, calm and composed. One officer came to me, checking if I was all right, while the other quietly spoke to the man. His anger seemed to have subsided, but he still appeared upset. The officer escorted him out, without handcuffs, and they conversed for a good 20 minutes. One officer left with the man, while the other stayed inside to ensure he didn't return. I still shudder to think what could have happened if my wife hadn't been on the phone and then called the police. I never did see that man again, nor did I file any official report. After that night, I decided to give up the overnight shift. I know others have had far worse experiences working overnight, and my heart goes out to them. But this personal encounter, though it didn't leave me physically harmed, will always be a chilling memory that I will never forget.